now at a time when North Africa and the Middle East are beset by violence in reaction to the now infamous American film insulting the Prophet Muhammad. And locations from Sydney to the Philippines are seeing protests. Perhaps the last thing that was needed was the willful fanning of the flames of such an incendiary issue.
But a controversial French satirical weekly, Charlie Hebdo, decided to do just that by publishing cartoon caricatures of the Prophet, proclaiming that they would shock those who wished to be shocked. As a precaution, the French government has decided to close French institutions in over 20 countries and all schools in Tunisia, which saw violent attacks last Friday.
To judge what the impact of this publication might be, we are joined on the line now by Nabila Ramdani, Arabist and journalist currently in Istanbul, and Anne Penketh, Programme Director of the British American Security Information Council, who is currently in France. Good evening and thanks for joining us on The Daily.
Good evening.
I want to just at a time, and often talk. We have so much discussion about budget cutbacks, and certainly France is probably not immune to cuts at its foreign ministry and probably in its defense forces. What type of pressure do you think is being weighed upon a title like Charlie Hebdo? Because clearly, just these foreign ministries do not have the resources probably to go and deploy to defend their institutions and consulates. Sorry, Nabila, I'll throw that your way. Pardon me.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the French government is certainly taking, the potential violence in the wake of the publications of these cartoons extremely seriously. And it has not only deployed its forces around the world and tightened security around its embassies and schools over 20 countries around the world, but even at home, security has been tightened. Protests have been organized in France, and it has to be said that the French Interior Minister, even the French Prime Minister himself, in fact, Jean-Marc Ayrault, has banned demonstrations planned for Saturday against not just the cartoons published by Charlie Hebdo today, but also against the movie that was produced in the U.S., Innocence of Muslims, which has, of course, caused an awful lot of anger around the Muslim world. And French Muslims, but also all the people who are going to take part in those protests cannot quite explain or cannot quite see how the Prime Minister can explain banning a democratic grassroots demonstration and how it fits in with the notion of free speech.
Anne Penketh from the British American Security Information Council. Whose hands does this play into? Because I go back to the fact that, and I was with some very senior diplomats from across the Middle East a couple of evenings ago, and they just talked about the pressure that their various missions have in capitals, and I think certainly for many European governments, this really caught them off guard. I mean, particularly, what we saw, with the Germans as well. So, do you think that there is pressure being applied, perhaps at a very soft level, behind the scenes, back on sort of national territory, that one wants to uphold free speech, but at the same time there is obviously a lot of pressure on missions abroad?
Well, I think that's it. They're clearly in a dilemma, actually. I mean, on the one hand, everybody, including the ministers and the Prime Minister, here are referring to freedom of speech, but on the other hand, there is the issue of journalists operating within the law, and I think there is an argument that what Charlie Hebdo is doing could easily be termed an incitement to racism. And in fact, there already has been a suit which has been launched, and I think that's probably the way this will go. I mean, it must be said that Charlie Hebdo has got form, over the years. Particularly, it published the Danish cartoons a few years ago. It's also actually been sued by the Catholic Church for taking them on as well. But of course at Charlie Hebdo they say, we're just journalists, we're just doing our job, this was the best news story around, and so then it comes down to the violent reaction.
And you wonder if it is worth it at all for the violent reaction. But the reaction that's happened so far with all the closures of schools, cultural centres and embassies, is this, do you think it's an over cautious reaction, or is it a valid response?
You might think that it was over the top. However, of course, you have to look at the timing of this. And already there's been such outrage and uproar across the Muslim world because of this anti-Islamic the trailer, the innocence of Muslims. And so I think under the circumstances, it's understandable, the French reaction. On the other hand, I think, for example, on Saturday, here in Paris, there was, although it was a banned demonstration, only about 100 people showed up in the center of Paris outside the American embassy. So to a certain extent, you get this rent-a-crowd reaction, don't you? Something that Salman Rushdie, in fact, who's very well placed to know, was talking about an outrage industry which is out there.
Nabila, you're in Istanbul, and it's been fascinating watching the images unfold, largely across North Africa and down into Sudan particularly. What's happened in Ankara and also in Istanbul outside of embassies and consulates? Because I have to say that I didn't see whether it was on Al Jazeera, any of the wire services, that we didn't see anything sort of erupting there, or was there something quite small scale happening?
Well, people are very much aware of, perhaps not so much about the publications of the French cartoons. And I have to say, I've been speaking to people today, and they were not particularly aware of the publications. But what they do know about is the posting online of the offensive video that was produced in the U.S., the very Islamophobic video, and they are particularly offended by that, and it can trigger all sorts of violent reactions. And let's not forget that it has so far led to at least 20 deaths around the world, and Charlie Hebdo, which took the decision to go ahead with the publications of these cartoons, and the guest is right. Charlie Hebdo has form on that. Charlie Hebdo is only too well aware of the number of deaths so far, and there are 6 million Muslims in mainland France, and the majority of them will be hugely saddened that the Prophet Muhammad is being mocked in this way. Unfortunately, but inevitably, there will be an angry and quite possibly violent minority who will take to the streets to vent their anger. And of course, nobody is condoning this behavior, but if it does break out, there is absolutely no doubt that Charlie Hebdo will be sharing a large part of the blame. And interestingly, the French government is showing extreme weakness in the fact, in the face of this growing crisis. But meanwhile, they are taking the threat of potential violence extremely seriously, and they are flooding all major cities with riot police, including many around the offices of Charlie Hebdo, and they are warning French people abroad to be particularly vigilant.
Just to both of you, before we go, and Anne, I'll start with you. I mean, how much practical dialogue or editorial have we seen, whether it's online, whether it's in newspapers, whether it's on television, but just the practical applications of the task that would face Washington and then state and of course municipal governments to also just go and shut this down. Not to mention that you're in the world's biggest economy, having then to deal with some of the biggest, most recognized, players in the digital space as well, to close all of this down. And, it's not as simple as everyone sort of says. And, it's not a case of just going and attacking consulates. And I'm wondering, have we seen any type of dialogue to say, yes, perhaps it might be wrong, but there are a few practicalities in front of this as well.
Whose perspective?
Exactly.
I mean, I think that you do come down in the West. You do have this very strong notion of freedom of expression. I can say something which might offend you, but if I do that, then you don't have to listen to me, you can go away, you can switch off your TV, you don't need to buy Charlie Hebdo. And this is something which, of course, is not necessarily understood in other places.
And Nabila, I mean, just to you as well. I mean, whether you're one's listening to Al Arabiya or you're reading, Hurriyet, was there, do you think, enough of an editorial line, and perhaps sort of the responsible role of some editors and journalists to say that one needs to perhaps throw, a little bit of not cold water on the issue, but certainly, again, coming back to just the mechanics of the U.S. government having to deal with it is not that simple. It can't happen in 1 minute.
Well, what's very much discussed is the responsibility of journalists in all that, and clearly the issue of freedom of speech and what should be or should not be allowed to be expressed in a democracy. And in the context of France in particular, people are bringing to the fore a very highly publicized case that took place last summer, in fact, when the British fashion designer John Galliano was fined after being found guilty of launching an anti-Semitic rant in a private moment in a bar when he was drunk. So as I said, he was arrested, he was then convicted, and he was right and proper because, of course, this kind of comments are unbearable and are outlawed in France. And people wonder why the same principles cannot extend to protect Muslims from Islamophobic comments. And the vast majority of people see it not as freedom of speech, but an abuse of freedom of speech because it comes with responsibility. And this idea that freedom of speech allows you to go about Muslim baiting is quite absurd. And the view of people is that it's pure racism dressed up as satire.
Very astute. Nabila Ramdani in Istanbul and Penketh in Paris. Thanks very much for that. You're listening to the Monocle Daily.